The fluorescent lights flickered overhead as Emma Rodriguez clutched her manila folder, her palms slick with sweat. Years of investigation had led to this moment, a single piece of evidence that could unravel a decade-long conspiracy. As she approached the witness stand, the courtroom fell into a razor-sharp silence. Her heart thundered. One revelation could change everything. Emma knew the risks. For 18 months, she had been meticulously collecting evidence, following a trail of corruption that wound through the highest echelons of the city's political and judicial system. Each document, each whispered conversation, each late-night meeting with anonymous sources had brought her closer to the truth, a truth that powerful people wanted to remain buried. The case centered around Marcos Delgado, a prominent city council member with connections that seemed to stretch into every dark corner of municipal governance. What had started as a routine investigative piece about local infrastructure contracts had morphed into something far more sinister. Emma had uncovered a network of bribes, false documentation, and deliberate misappropriation of public funds that totaled nearly $47 million. Her fingers traced the edge of the folder, a collection of bank statements, email chains, and classified documents that had been leaked to her by a source she knew only as Nighthawk. The source had everything to lose and nothing to gain, except perhaps a shot at redemption. Judge Helena Reyes watched Emma carefully from the bench. They had a history, not a personal one, but a professional respect that had developed over years of Emma's investigative journalism exposing systemic corruption. The judge's reputation for uncompromising integrity was legendary, and Emma knew she would be scrutinizing every single piece of evidence with a laser-focused intensity. Across the courtroom, Marcos Delgado sat surrounded by a team of lawyers that looked more like a private army than legal counsel. His tailored Tom Ford suit and perfectly positioned Rolex betrayed a confidence that bordered on arrogance. But Emma had seen that look before. The practiced calm of a man who believed he was untouchable. The bailiff's voice cut through the tension. "State your full name for the record." "Emma Maria Rodriguez," she responded, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. "Investigative journalist with the Metropolitan Chronicle." As she was sworn in, Emma knew this was more than just testimony. This was a moment of reckoning. The documents in her folder represented more than evidence. They were a narrative of systemic corruption, a story of how power could be manipulated, twisted, and abused behind the veneer of public service. Her eyes met Delgado's. No words were exchanged, but the message was clear. The truth was about to come out, regardless of the consequences. The Los Angeles County Courthouse had become a pressure cooker of racial tension, media frenzy, and unprecedented legal drama. September 22, 1995. A date that would be etched into American legal history forever. The courtroom itself seemed to hold its breath, packed with reporters, legal experts, and spectators who had followed every moment of the most watched trial of the century. Marcia Clark stood at the prosecution table, her carefully prepared case seemingly unraveling before her eyes. She had been more than a prosecutor, she had been a symbol of hope for the families of Nicole Brown Simpson and Ronald Goldman. Her meticulously constructed narrative of guilt now balanced on a knife's edge, threatened by the brilliant legal maneuvering of Johnny Cochran and the dream team of defense attorneys. O.J. Simpson himself sat with an inscrutability that had become his trademark throughout the 9-month trial. A fallen hero, once celebrated as a football legend and Hollywood personality, now reduced to a defendant whose every movement was scrutinized. His tailored suits and controlled demeanor belied the storm of public opinion that raged around him. Inside the jury room, the deliberations had been intense and charged. 12 individuals from diverse backgrounds, each carrying their own experiences of race, justice, and personal bias. They had sat through months of testimony, forensic evidence, and legal arguments. Now they would make a decision that would reverberate far beyond the walls of this courtroom. Detective Mark Furman's racist comments had become a pivotal moment in the trial. What had begun as a murder investigation had transformed into a searing examination of systemic racism within the Los Angeles Police Department. Cochran had masterfully turned the spotlight from the brutal murders to the credibility of the police investigation. The media circus outside had reached a fever pitch. Satellite trucks lined the streets, cameras poised to capture every moment. Television networks had interrupted regular programming, preparing for a live broadcast that would unite and divide the nation in equal measure. Black and white Americans watched the same screen, but saw entirely different narratives. At precisely 10:07 a.m., the jury filed in. Their faces revealed nothing, a studied neutrality that kept everyone guessing. Judge Lance Ito's courtroom fell into a silence so profound that the rustle of a paper would have seemed like a thunderclap. We, the jury in the above-entitled action, find the defendant, Orenthal James Simpson, not guilty of the crime of murder, the jury foreman read. The reaction was instantaneous and explosive. In the courtroom, black spectators erupted in celebration, while many white observers sat in stunned disbelief. Outside, the scene was replicated across millions of living rooms, a nation divided, watching a moment that would define a generation. For some, it was a victory against a perceived racist justice system. For others, it was a miscarriage of justice that mocked the memory of two brutally murdered victims. The verdict was more than a legal decision. It was a cultural earthquake that exposed the deep racial fissures running through American society. The Palace of Justice in Nuremberg stood as a monument to a world emerging from the darkest chapter of human history. The International Military Tribunal was more than a legal proceeding. It was humanity's attempt to make sense of incomprehensible evil. 21 defendants sat in the dock, once powerful Nazi leaders now reduced to prisoners. Hermann Göring, the most senior Nazi official on trial, dominated the space with a defiant presence. His massive frame and calculated demeanor betrayed a man who still believed in the ideology that had brought Europe to its knees. Benjamin Ferencz, just 27 years old and the youngest prosecutor at the trials, carried a burden far beyond his years. A Jewish-American soldier who had personally investigated Nazi war crimes, he had collected evidence from concentration camps that defied human comprehension. Each document, each photograph was a testament to systematic murder on an industrial scale. The courtroom became a battlefield of moral reckoning. Defendants claimed they were simply following orders, a defense that would become infamous as the Nuremberg defense. But Ferencz and his colleagues were determined to prove something more profound, that individual moral choice exists even in the most oppressive systems. Translation equipment hummed constantly, creating a babel of languages that reflected the international nature of the tribunal. American, British, French, and Soviet judges sat together, former enemies now united in pursuit of justice. The proceedings were unprecedented. Never before had an entire state's leadership been put on trial for crimes against humanity. Göring sparred intellectually with the prosecutors, his legal mind as sharp as his Nazi rhetoric was venomous. He saw the trial as a political show, a victor's justice. But the evidence told a different story: meticulously documented reports of mass extermination, medical experiments, and calculated brutality that shocked the world's conscience. Witness testimonies brought the horror into sharp focus. Survivors of concentration camps, their bodies marked by unimaginable suffering, stood before the court. They were not just witnesses but living proof of the crimes committed. Each testimony was a knife-edge moment, personal pain confronting systematic evil. The prosecutors faced an impossible challenge. How do you legally define crimes so massive, so beyond human understanding, that they seemed to break every previous concept of war and humanity? They were creating a new language of international law, establishing principles that would reshape global understanding of human rights. As the trial progressed, the world watched. This was more than a legal proceeding. It was a moral tribunal, an attempt to draw a line between civilization and barbarism. Every argument, every piece of evidence was a statement about human nature, about the capacity for both unspeakable cruelty and remarkable moral courage. The Senate caucus room was electric with tension. Rows of senators sat like judges of history, their faces etched with the weight of what was about to unfold. John Dean, a 34-year-old White House counsel, adjusted his glasses and leaned into the microphone. Behind him, the American flag stood as a silent witness to the most significant political testimony in modern history. Outside, Washington buzzed with anticipation. Television networks had interrupted regular programming. Millions of Americans were about to watch the potential unraveling of a presidency in real time. The hearing room felt like a theater of national reckoning. Dean's testimony was a carefully orchestrated demolition of presidential immunity. He spoke of a systematic cover-up that reached the highest levels of government, detailing conversations with President Richard Nixon that revealed a web of corruption, obstruction, and abuse of power. Each word was a calculated blow against the Nixon administration. The Watergate scandal had begun 2 years earlier with a seemingly minor break-in at the Democratic National Committee headquarters. What had started as a botched political espionage attempt had mushroomed into a constitutional crisis that would reshape American politics forever. Senator Sam Ervin, the chairman of the Senate Watergate Committee, listened intently. A constitutional lawyer from North Carolina, Ervin had become the unlikely hero of the investigation. His folksy demeanor masked a razor-sharp legal mind committed to uncovering the truth. Dean's most explosive revelation came when he described what he called the cancer on the presidency, a phrase that would become legendary in political circles. He detailed how the White House had systematically attempted to cover up its involvement in the Watergate break-in, using every tool of presidential power to obstruct justice. The Republicans on the committee squirmed. This was more than a political scandal. It was an existential threat to the very principles of American democracy. Nixon's closest advisors had been arrested, his administration was in shambles, and now his own counsel was testifying against him. Cameras captured every moment. Dean's wife, Maureen, sat behind him, a pillar of support for a man who was essentially committing professional suicide. By testifying, he was burning every bridge in Washington, risking everything to reveal the truth. The hearing was a high-wire act of political drama. Each revelation peeled back another layer of corruption, showing how power could be manipulated and abused at the highest levels of government. It was a moment that would forever change how Americans viewed their political institutions. The Florida courtroom buzzed with an electric tension that defied the usual judicial decorum. Theodore Robert Bundy sat at the defense table, not as a defendant cowering before justice, but as a predator who had transformed the legal system into his own hunting ground. His tailored suit and meticulously combed hair betrayed no hint of the monstrous crimes that had shocked the nation. When Judge Edward Cowart granted Bundy's request to act as his own attorney, it was more than a legal maneuver. It was the beginning of a psychological chess match that would captivate and horrify America. Bundy understood something profound about courtrooms. They were stages, and he was about to deliver the performance of his life. The prosecution team watched warily. They knew Bundy was no ordinary defendant. A law student turned serial killer, he possessed an intelligence that made him exponentially more dangerous. His charm was a weapon, his eloquence a shield. Every cross-examination became a psychological warfare, with Bundy probing witnesses, searching for vulnerabilities, manipulating emotions with surgical precision. During the Chi Almga murder trial in Tallahassee, Bundy's legal strategy was a masterclass in psychological manipulation. He would ask questions that seemed innocuous but were carefully designed to undermine witness credibility. His law background gave him an intimate understanding of legal procedures, allowing him to object, challenge, and redirect with a skill that shocked even seasoned legal professionals. The victims' families sat in the gallery, their pain a stark contrast to Bundy's calculated composure. Lisa Levy's mother watched as Bundy cross-examined experts about the forensic evidence, his tone clinical, almost academic. He dissected medical reports, challenged blood spatter analysis, and presented himself not as a monster, but as a wronged intellectual fighting against a system determined to convict him. Judge Cowart found himself in an unprecedented situation. Bundy was simultaneously the most compelling and most repulsive defendant he had ever encountered. The killer's legal arguments were often surprisingly sophisticated, peppered with legal terminology and procedural challenges that forced the court to take him seriously. Television cameras captured every moment. This was more than a trial. It was a public spectacle where a serial killer used the very system designed to bring him to justice as his personal platform. Bundy understood the power of media, the attraction of true crime, the public's morbid fascination with evil wrapped in an attractive package. When the verdict came, Bundy's reaction was telling. Even as he was convicted, He maintained a performance of intellectual superiority. His final statement to the court was not a plea for mercy, but a critique of the judicial system, delivered with a chilling combination of eloquence and arrogance. The Supreme Court chamber felt charged with historical anticipation. Thurgood Marshall stood before the justices, a 38-year-old lawyer whose entire life had been a preparation for this moment. His crisp Navy veteran's posture and meticulously prepared arguments were a stark contrast to the centuries of legal oppression he was about to challenge. The case wasn't just about school segregation. It was a direct assault on the 1896 Plessy v. Ferguson decision that had enshrined separate but equal as the law of the land. Marshall represented the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, carrying the hopes of millions of Black Americans who had endured generations of systemic discrimination. Behind Marshall's arguments was a profound psychological truth. Segregation wasn't just about physical separation, it was a system designed to break the spirit of Black Americans. The legal team had collected devastating social science evidence, including the now famous doll tests by Kenneth and Mamie Clark. These tests revealed how segregation damaged the self-perception of Black children, who consistently chose white dolls as more desirable, internalizing the racism that surrounded them. Chief Justice Earl Warren listened intently. A Republican appointed by Eisenhower, Warren had become an unexpected champion of civil rights. He understood that this case was about more than legal interpretation. It was about the very soul of American democracy. Marshall's legal strategy was brilliant. Rather than argue that segregation violated the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause in the way previous lawyers had, he attacked the fundamental psychological damage of segregation. The separate but equal doctrine was inherently unequal, he argued, because it implied Black children were inferior. The courtroom was a microcosm of a nation in transition. Outside, the South simmered with resistance. Political leaders in states like Alabama and Mississippi were already preparing their defiance. But inside this chamber, something monumental was happening. The law was being rewritten to recognize the full humanity of Black Americans. When Warren read the unanimous decision on May 17, 1954, it was more than a legal ruling. It was a moral declaration. Separate educational facilities are inherently unequal. The decision read. Those 9 words would reshape American society more profoundly than any legislation in decades. Marshall knew the battle was far from over. Implementing the decision would require years of struggle, resistance, and continued legal battles. But in that moment, he had struck a decisive blow against the architecture of racism that had defined American life for centuries. Courtrooms are crucibles of human emotion, where personal narratives collide with legal abstractions. Each trial is a complex tapestry woven from individual threads of pain, hope, desperation, and redemption. Take Maria Gonzalez, a domestic violence survivor testifying against her abuser. Her hands trembled as she approached the witness stand, years of psychological trauma etched into her posture. The legal system was more than a procedural mechanism, it was her last hope for justice, her chance to reclaim her narrative. In another courtroom, an elderly Holocaust survivor confronted a Nazi collaborator decades after his crimes. His testimony wasn't just evidence, it was a living history, a personal reckoning with a past that had haunted generations. Each word was a testament to human resilience, a refusal to let evil remain unnamed or unpunished. Wrongful conviction cases revealed the most profound human vulnerabilities. Men and women who had lost decades to prison systems, exonerated by new evidence, walked into courtrooms carrying the weight of stolen years. Their stories weren't just legal arguments but profound explorations of systemic failure and individual survival. The most compelling courtroom moments transcended legal technicalities. They were about human transformation, victims finding their voice, perpetrators confronting their actions, society wrestling with complex moral questions. A rape victim's impact statement could be more powerful than forensic evidence. A defendant's genuine remorse might reveal more truth than hours of testimony. Some lawyers became architects of human dignity. They didn't just argue cases, they reconstructed narratives, gave voice to the voiceless, challenged systemic injustices. Their work was a form of social surgery, cutting through layers of institutional indifference to expose fundamental human truths. Expert witnesses brought scientific precision to human stories. A forensic psychologist might explain the neurological impacts of trauma. A DNA expert could unravel complex genetic narratives that exposed generational injustices. Their testimony transformed personal pain into verifiable scientific understanding. The most profound legal moments were never about winning or losing, they were about recognition, acknowledging harm, validating experiences, creating spaces for healing. Justice was less a destination and more a continuous journey of human understanding. Justice is never a destination. It is a journey, a continuous dialogue between human fallibility and our highest moral aspirations. Each landmark courtroom moment represents more than a legal verdict. It is a snapshot of societal evolution, a moment when humanity attempts to define its own moral boundaries. Consider the ripple effects of these dramatic moments. The Nuremberg trials didn't just prosecute Nazi war criminals, they established international human rights laws that would protect generations. Brown v. Board of Education wasn't simply about school integration, it was a fundamental reimagining of human equality. The Watergate hearings transformed how citizens understood political accountability. These trials were never just about individuals. They were collective reckonings, moments when societies confronted their deepest hypocrisies and most challenging moral questions. They revealed the complex machinery of justice, imperfect yet persistently striving toward a more equitable understanding of human rights. Technological advances were reshaping legal proceedings. Digital evidence, forensic breakthroughs, and global communication networks were creating new landscapes of legal investigation. Yet the fundamental human elements remained unchanged: the search for truth, the desire for accountability, the hope for redemption. Some trials became historical watersheds. They weren't just legal proceedings but cultural moments that redefined national narratives. The O.J. Simpson trial exposed racial tensions. The Nuremberg trials demonstrated humanity's capacity to confront systemic evil. Each case was a mirror reflecting societal complexities. The most powerful courtroom moments transcended legal technicalities. They were about human dignity, about giving voice to the voiceless, about challenging systemic injustices. A single testimony could expose generations of oppression. A moment of genuine human connection could transform understanding. Yet justice remained imperfect. For every landmark case that advanced human rights, countless stories remained unheard. The legal system was a continuous negotiation between ideals and realities, between the world as it is and the world as it could be. In the end, these dramatic courtroom moments were testament to humanity's most profound characteristic: our relentless pursuit of understanding, our capacity to confront our own darkness, and our persistent hope for something better. Epilogue. In the theater of justice, truth is the most unpredictable performer of all.